My 18-year-old daughter spent her entire savings and woke up at 4 in the morning to cook a gourmet Southern fusion feast for 29 relatives. It was my mother's 60th birthday, and my daughter wanted it to be perfect. But hours before the party, my mother sent a text canceling the whole thing because our home-cooked food was not upscale enough for her guests. I watched my daughter cry as she threw hundreds of dollars of seafood into the trash. I did not yell and I did not argue. I stayed completely quiet and made one single phone call instead. The next morning, my mother was standing outside my security gates, begging for forgiveness. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed her perfect evening, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your child from toxic family members. My name is Nia and I am 38 years old living in Atlanta, Georgia. For most of my adult life, I have navigated the complicated dynamics of an affluent family that values outward appearances far more than genuine connection. My mother Vivian thrives on social status, country club memberships, and the approval of her elite social circles. She has always favored my younger sister Jasmine, who followed the perfect path by marrying a wealthy finance director named Connor. But this story is not just about my mother or my sister, it is about my daughter Zuri. Zuri is 18, and she has a gift that you cannot teach. She understands food the way a poet understands words. Just last month, she was accepted into the Culinary Institute of America, which is one of the most prestigious culinary schools in the world. She worked incredibly hard for that acceptance, spending every weekend in the kitchen, testing recipes and studying flavor profiles. She is a culinary prodigy, and her dream has always been to bring our rich cultural heritage into fine dining. When my mother's 60th birthday approached, Zuri saw it as the perfect opportunity to showcase her talent to the entire extended family. She wanted to prove herself to a grandmother who had always treated her as an afterthought. The day of the party began long before the sun came up. I remember walking downstairs at 4 in the morning and finding the kitchen lights already blazing. Zuri was standing by the stove, her hair tied back in a neat bun, wearing her favorite white chef coat. The air was already thick with the rich, earthy scent of a dark roux cooking slowly in a massive cast-iron pot. She was making a traditional seafood gumbo, but elevating it with a modern fusion twist that she had spent weeks perfecting. She had carefully chopped the holy trinity of onions, bell peppers, and celery, and they were currently caramelizing in butter, filling the entire ground floor of our home with an incredible warmth. What broke my heart, but also made me incredibly proud, was knowing exactly how Zuri had funded this feast. She did not ask me for a single dollar, even though I would have gladly given it to her. For the past 3 months, she had been working long shifts at an artisan bakery downtown, saving every paycheck in a jar hidden in her bedroom. She took those hard-earned savings and went to the premium farmers market to source the absolute best ingredients. She bought pounds of fresh lump crab meat, jumbo Gulf shrimp, and imported spices. Out on the back patio, she had set up our industrial smoker the night before. Inside that smoker was a massive prime brisket that had been slowly cooking over hickory wood for 12 hours. She had stayed up half the night just to monitor the temperature, ensuring the meat would be perfectly tender and flavorful for her grandmother. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, holding my cup of morning coffee, just watching her work. She moved with such grace and precision, peeling shrimp, reducing stalks, and tasting sauces with intense concentration. She was preparing enough food for 29 people, including aunts, uncles, and cousins who were supposed to arrive later that afternoon. I wanted to tell her to slow down and rest, but I saw the bright hope shining in her eyes. Zuri desperately wanted Vivian to look at her with the same pride she reserved for Jasmine and Connor. As a mother, it is a uniquely painful experience to watch your child try to earn love from someone who is fundamentally incapable of giving it unconditionally. I knew my mother's nature better than anyone, but I could not bring myself to crush Zuri's enthusiasm on a day she had planned so meticulously. I have spent my entire adult life building a fortress around my daughter, protecting her from the toxic expectations of my family. I built my real estate empire quietly, refusing to let my mother use my success for her own social climbing. But Zuri, with her open heart and immense talent, still believed she could win them over with her food. She believed that if she just cooked the perfect meal, if she just proved how talented she was, my mother would finally embrace her. I knew the truth about Vivian. I knew that to my mother, anything less than a high-end reservation or an elite lifestyle was considered beneath her. Yet I sat on the sofa beside my beautiful, exhausted 18-year-old daughter, offering her encouraging smiles and pretending everything was going to be wonderful. I wanted so badly for her to have this moment of triumph. I wanted my family to walk through that front door and be amazed by the incredible spread she had created. By noon, the kitchen looked like the staging area of a prestigious restaurant. Zuri had prepared a sprawling buffet of Southern fusion dishes. There were perfectly seared scallops over sweet potato puree, miniature cornbread blinis topped with caviar, and the massive 12-hour smoked brisket resting on a wooden carving board. The gumbo bubbled softly on the back burner, rich and aromatic. She had even baked a three-tier red velvet cake decorated with edible gold leaf and sugar flowers, specifically tailored to match my mother's elegant tastes. The dining table was set beautifully with crisp white linens, polished silver, and fresh floral centerpieces that Zuri had arranged herself. Every single detail was a labor of pure love and dedication. As the clock ticked closer to 5 in the evening, Zuri went upstairs to change into a nice dress, her face flushed with excitement and exhaustion. She came back down looking beautiful and nervous, constantly adjusting the silverware and checking the temperature of the warming trays. The house was immaculate. The food was spectacular, and the atmosphere was filled with the kind of welcoming warmth that you can only find in a home where someone has poured their soul into cooking for the people they love. We waited together in the living room, listening for the sound of cars pulling up the driveway. I watched my daughter smooth the front of her dress, her eyes bright with anticipation, completely unaware of the devastating text message that was about to arrive on my phone. 5 o'clock arrived with the heavy chime of the grandfather clock in our hallway. Then 5:15. Then 5:30. The silence in the house was becoming unbearable. Zuri kept walking to the window, parting the blinds just a fraction to peek down the driveway. I could see the nervous energy radiating off her shoulders. I was just about to tell her that traffic on the connector was probably heavy when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up with my mother's name. I picked it up, expecting a text asking for directions or apologizing for running late. Instead, the message I read made the blood freeze in my veins. Nia, change of plans. Jasmine and Connor felt that a home-cooked meal just is not the right vibe for my milestone birthday. Connor actually managed to pull some strings and get us a last-minute VIP reservation at the Sovereign. We are already heading downtown. Since it is such an exclusive venue, we decided to make it an adults-only evening. Sorry about the food. Tell Zuri thank you for trying anyway. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words over and over again. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. My mother did not even have the decency to call. She sent a text message to cancel a dinner that her granddaughter had spent her entire savings and 18 hours preparing. And the reason was that my sister and her arrogant finance bro husband Connor decided my daughter's food was not upscale enough for them. The Sovereign was the most exclusive French-American restaurant in Atlanta, notoriously difficult to get into and notoriously pretentious. Connor had clearly wanted to show off his wealth, and my mother had eagerly gone along with it, completely discarding Zuri's efforts without a second thought. The adults-only edition was the final insult, a deliberate exclusion of the very person who had worked so hard to celebrate her. I knew exactly how this conversation had played out in their pristine suburban mansion. Connor probably wrinkled his nose at the idea of driving to my neighborhood. Jasmine, the golden child who never lifted a finger in the kitchen, likely complained about smelling like barbecue smoke. And my mother, desperate to maintain her proximity to Connor's white privilege and financial status, immediately caved. They chose the illusion of elite status over the genuine love of their own flesh and blood. They chose to be seen at the Sovereign rather than be loved in my dining room. Zuri turned away from the window and looked at me. Her smile faltered when she saw my face. She walked over, and I did not try to hide the screen from her. She needed to see exactly who these people were. I watched her read the message. I watched the light completely die in her beautiful brown eyes. She did not scream. She did not throw a tantrum. Instead, a devastatingly quiet resignation washed over her face, as if she had secretly known all along that she would never be good enough for them. Zuri turned around and walked back into the dining room. I followed her, my heart breaking with every step she took. She stood at the head of the perfectly set table, looking at the magnificent spread she had created. The gumbo was still gently simmering in the kitchen. The brisket was resting perfectly. The three-tier cake stood as a masterpiece of her dedication. Then, without saying a word, Zuri reached down and picked up the heavy silver platter holding the seared scallops and caviar blinis. She walked directly into the kitchen, opened the stainless steel trash can, and scraped the entire platter of expensive, carefully prepared appetizers straight into the garbage. The sound of the food hitting the bottom of the empty bin echoed loudly in the silent kitchen. It was the sound of my daughter's heart breaking. She turned back to grab the carving board with the 12-hour smoked brisket. That was when I stepped forward and gently caught her wrists. Her hands were shaking violently. When she finally looked up at me, tears were streaming down her face, ruining the makeup she had so carefully applied. She choked out a sob, asking what she did wrong, asking why her food was not good enough for her own grandmother. She asked why she was not good enough. In that exact moment, a cold, calculated fury replaced the initial shock in my chest. I pulled my daughter into my arms and held her tightly as she cried into my shoulder. I stroked her hair and whispered that she did absolutely nothing wrong. I told her that her food was a masterpiece and that the failure belonged entirely to them. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse. I did not reach for my phone to call my mother and scream at her. Yelling would not fix my daughter's broken heart. Crying would not teach these people a lesson. For 18 years, I had played the quiet outcast, the teen mother, who supposedly ruined her life, while Jasmine became the pristine golden child. I had let them believe their own narrative because their opinions did not pay my bills. But tonight was different. Tonight they had hurt my child. As I held her trembling shoulders, the kitchen around us seemed to blur and fade away. The pristine marble countertops and state-of-the-art appliances vanished, replaced by the memory of a cramped, dimly lit living room 18 years ago. The physical sensation of holding my crying daughter transported me violently back to the day I stood in front of Vivian at 20 years old, terrified and pregnant. The slow, steady hum of the refrigerator in the present was drowned out by the echo of my mother's voice from the past. I felt the camera of my mind slowly tracking around the room, pulling my focus away from the warmth of my child and into the freezing cold reality of my history. I remembered the exact look of disgust on her face when I told her I was keeping the baby. She was wearing her Sunday best, having just returned from a church committee meeting, where she had spent hours bragging about Jasmine's recent acceptance into an Ivy League university. I stood there clutching a cheap ultrasound photo, while she paced the hardwood floor, treating me like a stain on her perfect oriental rug. She told me I was a disgrace. She said I was throwing away my future, and worse, that I was ruining the family image. In Vivian's world, a pregnant 20-year-old dropout was a social liability she simply could not afford to keep around. She handed me a trash bag and gave me exactly 1 hour to pack my belongings. I remember the sound of Jasmine practicing the piano in the other room, a perfect, flawless melody that served as the soundtrack to my expulsion. Jasmine did not even stop playing to say goodbye when I walked out the front door into the pouring rain with nothing but a few clothes and the baby growing inside me. Vivian thought tossing me out would break me. She expected me to come crawling back a few months later, begging for her charity and willing to submit to her control. She did not realize that the moment that heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, a new version of myself was born. Over the next 18 years, I did not just survive, I built an impenetrable fortress. While Jasmine was busy attending elite networking mixers and finding a finance husband to fund her lifestyle, I was working 3 jobs. While my mother was hosting charity galas, I was studying commercial real estate market trends at the public library until 2 in the morning. I bought my first foreclosed property, at 23 flipped it, and used the profit to buy 2 more. By the time I was 30, I was quietly acquiring prime commercial real estate across the East Coast. I shed the scared, vulnerable girl Vivian had kicked out and forged a woman made of steel and strategy. I learned to mask my emotions, to negotiate without blinking, and to never let anyone see me bleed. That armor kept Zuri fed, housed, and loved, and it kept my family completely in the dark about who I had really become. They wanted to view me as the struggling single mother because it validated their own superiority. I let them keep their comfortable delusions because flying under the radar was the greatest tactical advantage a CEO could have. The memory faded, pulling me back to the present reality of my beautiful 18-year-old daughter, weeping over a ruined platter of seafood. My expression hardened into stone. A normal person would have thrown the phone across the room. A normal sister would have called Jasmine and screamed until her vocal cords tore. But I was not normal, and I had not been for a very long time. I gently pulled away from Zuri, wiping the tears from her cheeks with my thumbs. I looked her directly in the eyes and promised her that this incredible food would not go to waste. I promised her that tonight she would be celebrated exactly the way she deserved. I stepped back, taking a deep breath that filled my lungs with cold, absolute clarity. I picked up my phone from the counter where Vivian's cruel message still glowed on the screen. The text was a masterclass in elite condescension, a desperate cling to false superiority. 18 years ago, I might have sent back a paragraph of apologies or a desperate plea for them to reconsider. 10 years ago, I might have cursed her out. Today, I did neither. I did not give her the satisfaction of my anger or the validation of my tears. I unlocked the screen, my fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. I typed exactly 2 words. No worries. I hit send and tossed the personal phone back onto the counter face down. I watched the screen go dark, severing the emotional tie to the woman who gave birth to me. The simple 2-word response was the ultimate psychological weapon. It gave them absolutely nothing to feed on. Vivian would be sitting in the back of some luxury town car, staring at those 2 words, wondering why I was not begging or crying. She would assume I was defeated, too ashamed to fight back. Let her think that. Let Connor smirk and adjust his expensive tie, believing he had successfully put the poor single mother relative back in her place. Let Jasmine lean her head against the leather seats, completely secure in her delusion that she was the only successful daughter in the family. They were walking blindly into a trap they did not even know existed. I turned my attention back to the kitchen. The air was still thick with the incredible aroma of Zuri's hard work. The gumbo, the brisket, the perfectly executed fusion dishes. They were a testament to my daughter's brilliance. They represented dedication, passion, and an authentic love that Vivian and her crew could never comprehend, let alone appreciate. I looked at the trash can where the scallops had fallen. It was a casualty of war, but it would be the only one. I told Zuri to wash her face and put on her best dress, the one we had bought for her culinary school orientation. When she asked why, her voice still trembling, I simply smiled, the kind of smile that made my business competitors sweat. I told her we were going out. I did not explain the grand plan to her yet, because the machinery of my retaliation needed to be set into motion immediately. Every second counted. I needed to ensure that the stage was perfectly set before the curtain rose on my mother's supposed night of triumph. My personal phone was for family drama, but my business phone, a sleek black device I kept in my home office, was the key to my empire. It was the device that held the contacts to unlisted numbers, private wealth managers, and the executive teams of the properties I silently owned. I walked out of the kitchen and headed straight down the hall, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The echo of my steps sounded like a countdown. Vivian wanted an exclusive upscale adults-only evening at the Sovereign. She wanted to demonstrate her power by changing venues and leaving us in the dust. I was about to show her what real power looked like. I walked into my home office and firmly pushed the heavy mahogany doors shut behind me. The room was bathed in shadows, illuminated only by the faint golden glow of the Atlanta city skyline piercing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked over to my desk and sat in the high-backed leather chair. If someone had been sitting on the floor looking up at me in that exact second, they would have seen a woman who had completely detached from the pain of rejection and transitioned entirely into a predator setting a trap. I reached past my standard phone and picked up the secondary business line. It was a sleek encrypted device that I used exclusively for high-level corporate operations and communicating directly with my executive team. I dialed the direct line of my executive assistant, Marcus. Marcus is a brilliant, ruthlessly efficient operator who never asks unnecessary questions and executes complex directives with terrifying speed. He answered on the very first ring. I kept my voice absolutely even devoid of any emotional tremor and issued my first command. I told him to initiate an immediate and total lockdown of the entire VIP floor at the Sovereign. Vivian, Jasmine, and Connor thought they had secured a prestigious last-minute reservation there to flaunt their status. What they completely failed to realize was that Obsidian Estates had quietly finalized the acquisition of the hospitality group that managed the Sovereign exactly 3 months ago. They were not walking into an exclusive restaurant. They were walking directly onto my private property. I instructed Marcus to cancel every single reservation on that specific floor immediately. I told him to redirect any existing VIP guests to our sister properties downtown, and to authorize complimentary champagne and premium upgrades to ensure zero complaints. The Sovereign top tier was to be completely sealed off from the public. I made it explicitly clear that no one was to be seated, no one was to be served, and absolutely no one was to bypass the velvet ropes without my direct personal clearance. Marcus confirmed the directive instantly, and I could hear the rapid rhythmic clacking of his mechanical keyboard as he overrode the restaurant systems on his end. Next, I needed to handle the most important logistical element of the night. I told Marcus to dispatch our specialized temperature-controlled catering transport team to my personal residence immediately. I specifically requested our elite crisis management crew, the exact team we utilized for high-stakes corporate galas and private billionaire summits. I instructed them to arrive with professional-grade warming cabinets, shock-absorbent insulated carriers, and pristine serving equipment. We had a magnificent feast to move, and it had to be transported with forensic care to preserve the structural integrity and perfect temperature of Zurich. 12-hour smoked brisket, and delicate seafood gumbo. Marcus affirmed the estimated time of arrival was under 20 minutes. I hung up the encrypted phone and took a brief moment to look out the window at the sprawling city grid below. The reflection staring back at me in the dark glass was not the frightened, vulnerable 20-year-old single mother Vivian had violently discarded. It was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. I smoothed the lapels of my emerald silk suit, feeling the cool, expensive fabric beneath my fingertips. It was time to go back to the kitchen and prepare my daughter for the night she truly deserved. I walked back down the hallway, my heels silent on the plush runner rugs. Zuri was standing completely still by the kitchen island, staring blankly at the gorgeous three-tier red velvet cake she had spent hours painstakingly decorating. The edible gold leaf shimmered softly under the warm pendant lights, mocking the agonizing effort she had poured into it. I approached her gently and placed my hand under her chin, lifting her face so she had to look directly into my eyes. I told her to wipe her tears and listen to me very carefully. I explained that her grandmother and her aunt had made a catastrophic miscalculation today. They believed they could dismiss her hard work, trample on her dedication, and treat her like she was entirely invisible. But I promised her with a fierce conviction that made her eyes widen that her spectacular food was not going to sit in this kitchen and go to waste. I told her that a team of seasoned culinary professionals was on their way to our house right now. They were going to carefully pack up every single dish she had prepared, from the cornbread blinis to the brisket, and transport it safely downtown. Zuri looked bewildered, her eyebrows pulling together in confusion. She asked where we were taking the food. I smiled, feeling the cold thrill of the impending victory coursing through my veins. I told her we were taking it directly to the Sovereign. I explained that Vivian and Connor had gone to a restaurant expecting to be served a meal fit for the elite, completely unaware that the real culinary royalty was the chef they had just abandoned. I promised my daughter that tonight, her masterpiece would be served on gold-rimmed bone china plates in the most exclusive dining room in the entire city of Atlanta. I did not reveal to her yet that I actually owned the building. I simply told her that I had secured the VIP floor through my corporate connections and that we were going to host a private elite tasting. I wanted her to feel the pure triumph of her culinary skills being elevated to the highest possible stage without the distraction of family politics. I watched the realization wash over her beautiful face. The crushing sadness in her eyes was slowly replaced by a spark of hope and then a fierce, undeniable pride. Within exactly 18 minutes, 3 sleek black utility vans pulled into our circular driveway. A team of 6 professionals dressed in immaculate black uniforms stepped out carrying heavy-duty insulated transport boxes. Marcus had outdone himself. The crew moved with military precision, entering our kitchen and immediately assessing the massive spread. The lead coordinator, a highly meticulous woman named Sarah, approached Zuri with profound, unmistakable respect. She addressed my daughter as chef and asked for her specific instructions on how to properly handle the delicate sauces and temperature-sensitive meats. Hearing herself addressed with such professional reverence made Zuri stand a little taller. She dried her remaining tears, squared her shoulders, and began directing the seasoned team. I stood back and watched my daughter command the room with natural authority. She instructed them on exactly how to maintain the moisture in the brisket during transit and how to keep the dark roux of the gumbo from breaking. The catering crew listened intently, executing her orders flawlessly. They worked swiftly, transferring the exquisite dishes into commercial-grade containers. The kitchen, which had felt like a graveyard of rejected efforts just an hour ago, was now a bustling hub of high-stakes culinary logistics. Every single component of Zura's feast was secured, loaded into the temperature-controlled vans, and driven away toward the heart of the city. I told Zuri to go upstairs and get dressed in the pristine chef coat we had bought for her culinary school orientation. She was not going to the Sovereign as a discarded grandchild. She was walking through those heavy oak doors as the guest of honor and the head chef of the evening. As she ran up the stairs with a newfound energy in her step, I picked up my keys. The trap was set, the bait was in place, and the arrogant players were all converging on the exact location I controlled. The heavy glass doors of the Sovereign swung open, reflecting the amber glow of the Atlanta streetlights against the polished brass handles. A smooth panning motion would follow the trio as they stepped out of the humid Georgia evening and into the breathtaking climate-controlled sanctuary of the restaurant lobby. Vivian led the charge. She was dressed to the absolute nines, wearing a tailored ivory dress suit that practically screamed new money, attempting to look like old money. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, and she wore a diamond necklace that she made sure caught the light of the immense crystal chandelier hanging above them. Behind her walked 29 extended family members. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had quickly abandoned my daughter's home. Cooked meal the second Vivian dangled the promise of a free luxury dining experience. They huddled together, looking around the opulent space with wide eyes, treating Vivian like royalty, simply because she was granting them access to a world they could never afford on their own. Vivian soaked up their awe like a sponge absorbing water. She turned to the crowd of relatives blocking the entrance for other guests and began projecting her voice so that everyone in the immediate vicinity could hear her. She pointed out the imported Italian marble beneath their feet and the custom art pieces lining the walls, loudly attributing this entire magnificent experience to the boundless generosity of her son-in-law. She made sure to remind her sisters and cousins that an ordinary family dinner was simply not appropriate for a woman of her standing. She told them that a milestone birthday required an elite venue, and that they should all be incredibly grateful that Connor was wealthy enough to pull the right strings and accommodate 30 people at the very last minute. The relatives nodded eagerly, offering a chorus of exaggerated praise that only inflated Vivian's massive ego even further. Walking right beside Vivian was Jasmine, the undisputed golden child of the family. Jasmine carried herself with a manufactured air of superiority, clutching a designer handbag that cost more than most people's cars. She smiled condescendingly at the aunts and uncles, completely comfortable in her role as the princess who had successfully married into high finance. She leaned into her husband, casting a look of pure smugness at the rest of the family. Jasmine had spent her entire life being told she was better than me, simply because she followed the traditional path. Tonight, standing in the lobby of the most exclusive restaurant in the city, she truly believed she had won the ultimate prize. And then there was Connor. Connor embodied every negative stereotype of an arrogant finance bro, perfectly tailored into a bespoke navy blue suit. He walked with a swagger that demanded the world move out of his way, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt to ensure his ridiculously expensive watch was visible to everyone in the room. How was a man who believed that his bank account made him invincible and that his skin color combined with his title at the investment fund gave him automatic authority over every person in the service industry. As the group moved deeper into the grand lobby, Connor was loudly discussing a recent real estate acquisition, making sure to use financial jargon just to impress the relatives who had no idea what he was talking about. He thrived on their intimidation. The lobby of the Sovereign was designed to intimidate. It featured dark walnut paneling velvet seating areas and a massive central bar illuminated by soft recessed lighting. The air smelled of expensive cedar and fresh orchids. As the 29 relatives awkwardly gathered near the lounge area, afraid to touch anything, Vivian ushered Connor forward to claim their prize. Connor did not just walk up to the host stand, he approached it like a conquering general, surveying a newly captured territory. He bypassed a small line of waiting couples, stepping right up to the mahogany podium where the impeccably dressed maitre d' stood. Connor leaned heavily against the podium, invading the personal space of the restaurant staff member. He did not offer a polite greeting or wait to be addressed. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket, pulled out a heavy metal black card, and slapped it down onto the polished wood surface with a loud, definitive thud. The sound was designed to turn heads, and it worked. Several patrons seated at the nearby bar glanced over to see who was making such a disruptive entrance. Connor loved the attention. He cleared his throat loudly, ensuring that Vivian, Jasmine, and the entire congregation of relatives were paying close attention to his display of dominance. He told the maitre d' that he was Connor Bradley and that he had called earlier to secure the entire VIP floor for a private party of 30. He emphasized the word VIP, dragging it out, so the waiting couples behind him would know exactly how important he thought he was. He leaned in closer, tapping his index finger aggressively against the black card resting on the podium. He announced to the host, and essentially to the entire lobby, that he would be covering the full bill for the evening. He loudly demanded that the best sommelier be sent up to their private room immediately because his mother-in-law only drank vintage champagne and he refused to settle for anything less than the absolute best inventory the restaurant had to offer. Vivian stood a few feet behind him, beaming with a sickening amount of pride. She looked back at her sisters with a triumphant grin, completely intoxicated by the display of wealth and power her son-in-law was projecting. She whispered loudly to my aunt that this was how a true gentleman took care of his family. Jasmine nodded in agreement, looking at Connor with total adoration. They were all standing at the absolute peak of their arrogance, fully convinced that the world revolved entirely around their desires and their wallets. Connor crossed his arms over his chest, tapping his expensive shoe against the marble floor, impatient for the staff to bow to his demands and escort them to the private elevator. They were entirely oblivious to the trap that had already been sprung. The maitre d' did not even blink at the heavy metal card slammed onto his podium. He was a seasoned professional in his 50s who had served actual royalty and billionaire tech moguls. A mid-level finance director throwing a tantrum in a bespoke suit did not impress him in the slightest. He slowly picked up the black card, holding it by the edges as if it were contaminated, and turned his attention to the glowing screen of his reservation terminal. His fingers moved gracefully across the keyboard. Connor stood there with a smug grin, already turning his head to wink at Jasmine, who blew him a kiss from across the lobby. Vivian was busy pointing out the wine cellar to my aunt, completely oblivious to the silent digital execution happening at the podium. The maitre d' stopped typing. He stood perfectly straight, clasped his hands together over the mahogany wood, and offered Connor a smile that was chillingly polite. The kind of smile service workers use when they hold all the cards. "I am profoundly sorry, Mr. Bradley, but I have no record of a reservation for 30 guests under your name tonight." Connor let out a sharp scoff, shaking his head, as if he were dealing with an incompetent child. He leaned closer over the podium, invading the man's space again. "You need to refresh your system, buddy. I spoke to the booking coordinator 2 hours ago. I secured the entire VIP floor. Run the card. Charge whatever deposit you need. Just get my family upstairs right now before I lose my patience and call your general manager." The maitre d' did not reach for the card. His polite smile remained absolutely fixed in place. "I assure you my system is perfectly refreshed, sir. Your initial reservation was indeed entered into our books this afternoon. However, it was immediately flagged and cancelled at the corporate level 20 minutes ago. The VIP floor is entirely unavailable." The words hung in the air. The hushed atmosphere of the luxury lobby made it impossible for the closest relatives not to overhear. My aunt stopped admiring the wine cellar. Jasmine dropped her hand from her hip, her proud smile faltering into a look of genuine confusion. Connor felt the shift in the room's energy. His face flushed a dark, angry red. His authority was being questioned in front of the very audience he had brought here to conquer. He slammed his hand flat against the podium. "I do not care about a corporate glitch," he barked, his voice echoing off the Italian marble floors. "I have a black card sitting right in front of you. There is no limit on that account. I am telling you to manually override the system, open the VIP room, and charge me double for the inconvenience. Swipe the card right now." The maitre d' picked up the heavy metal card. He did not argue. He simply slid the magnetic stripe through the terminal reader facing Connor. A sharp electronic beep broke the silence. A bright red error message illuminated the small screen. The maitre d' swiped it a second time. Another harsh red flash. Another sharp beep. The color rapidly drained from Connor's face. The arrogant flush of anger vanished, replaced by a sickly pale shade of panic. He stared at the red light on the machine as if it were a physical impossibility. A man whose entire identity was built on financial supremacy was suddenly watching his ultimate weapon fail in front of 30 people. "That is a machine error," Connor stammered, his voice suddenly lacking its previous booming resonance. "Try it again. Type the numbers in manually. That account has millions in it." The maitre d' placed the black card back on the podium, sliding it slowly toward Connor. "It is not a machine error, Mr. Bradley. Your financial institution has not declined the transaction. Our parent company has declined you." Connor stared at him, completely bewildered. "What are you talking about? What parent company?" A direct security flag was issued from the executive board of Obsidian Estates, the parent corporation that owns and operates this restaurant group. The maitre d' explained, his voice echoing clearly across the suddenly silent lobby. The directive was explicit. Your specific name and this specific account number have been permanently blacklisted from our merchant services due to severe financial security flags. We are legally barred from processing any transactions from you at this property or any other property under our corporate umbrella. Your funds are not welcome here." A collective gasp rippled through the 29 relatives standing in the lobby. The whispering began instantly. The aunts and cousins who had just been praising Connor as a financial genius were now exchanging wide-eyed, scandalized looks. Jasmine rushed forward, pushing past her aunts to grab Connor's arm. Her designer bag swung wildly against her side. She demanded to know what was going on, loudly insisting that the restaurant was making a catastrophic mistake. Vivian marched right behind her daughter, her face contorted with supreme indignation. She pointed a manicured finger directly at the maitre d'. "Do you have any idea who we are?" she demanded. Her voice was shrill, shattering the elegant ambiance of the room. "My son-in-law is a senior investment director. You are making a terrible mistake, and I demand you take us up to the VIP room this instant." The maitre d' looked at my mother with a level of detachment that was utterly devastating. He did not raise his voice. He did not show an ounce of intimidation. "Madam, even if Mr. Bradley's payment method had not been blacklisted, I could not grant you access to the VIP floor. The entire upper level of the Sovereign has been bought out." Connor grabbed his useless black card off the counter, his hand visibly shaking. "Bought out by who? I was told it was open." "It was open until 45 minutes ago," the maitre d' replied. "The chairman of Obsidian Estates has commandeered the entire floor for a private elite tasting. The space is currently under strict executive lockdown. No one is permitted upstairs under any circumstances. You and your party will have to leave the premises immediately." The silence that followed the maitre d's command lasted only a fraction of a second before the sheer force of Connor's entitlement shattered it completely. The polished, unbothered facade of the wealthy finance director dissolved into pure, unfiltered rage. The visual perspective of the room seemed to vibrate with a frantic handheld energy, capturing the absolute loss of control from a man who had never been told no in his entire adult life. Connor lunged forward, slamming both hands flat against the mahogany podium with enough force to make the heavy reservation terminal rattle. He leaned his face mere inches from the maitre d'. His neck flushed a dangerous shade of crimson veins pulsing visibly against his starched white collar. He began shouting at the top of his lungs, completely abandoning any pretense of upper-class decorum. He screamed that he managed billions of dollars in assets, that he was a personal friend of the mayor, and that he would make it his absolute life mission to ensure this restaurant was bulldozed to the ground. He threatened to buy the entire hospitality group by Monday morning, just so he could personally stand in the lobby and fire every single employee, starting with the man behind the podium. Instead of calming him down, Jasmine fueled the fire. She clutched his arm, her designer bag slipping off her shoulder and hitting the floor, shouting that they were being humiliated on purpose. She demanded the names of every staff member in the lobby, pulling out her gold-plated smartphone and threatening to ruin their careers and personal lives on social media. But it was Vivian who took the chaos to an entirely different, infinitely more manipulative level. Seeing Connor's financial threats bouncing harmlessly off the immovable restaurant staff, Vivian decided to weaponize her social standing. She threw her hands into the air, causing her expensive diamond bracelets to clatter loudly, and began wailing about racial profiling. She spun around to face the crowded lobby, pointing an accusing finger at the maitre d'. She screamed that this was a targeted discriminatory attack against an affluent African-American family trying to celebrate a milestone birthday. She announced her title in the church community, listed the charities she supposedly funded, and declared that they were being denied service simply because a prestigious establishment could not stomach the sight of Black excellence occupying their VIP floor. The irony was entirely lost on her. She was screaming about discrimination while actively attempting to use her white son-in-law's financial privilege to bully her way into a room, completely unaware that the overarching power denying her entry was a Black woman. The 29 relatives who had followed Vivian into the lobby like a royal procession were now actively shrinking back toward the revolving glass doors. The awe and admiration that had plastered their faces just 10 minutes ago had entirely evaporated, replaced by profound, suffocating embarrassment. A few of the older aunts exchanged horrified glances, whispering furiously to each other while pulling their coats tighter around their shoulders. My cousin Marcus, a corporate lawyer himself, physically turned his back on the spectacle, pressing two fingers to his temples in absolute mortification. Several younger cousins had pulled out their phones not to defend Vivian, but to quietly record the epic, unhinged meltdown of the family's so-called perfect golden trio. The pristine, untouchable image Vivian had spent decades meticulously crafting was burning to ash right there on the imported Italian marble. The maitre d' remained standing perfectly straight, his hands clasped calmly behind his back. He did not call security. He did not raise his voice to match theirs. He simply let them scream, allowing their tantrum to echo off the vaulted ceilings for every patron in the main dining room to hear. The stark contrast between his quiet, immovable professionalism and their screaming, frantic desperation only made Vivian and Connor look even more pathetic. Realizing that his threats of buying the building were not having the desired effect, Connor lost the absolute last shred of his composure. He pounded his fist against the podium one final time, his voice cracking as he screamed his ultimate demand. He ordered the maitre d' to march upstairs right this second, interrupt the private tasting, and drag the chairman of Obsidian Estates down to the lobby. Connor roared that he did not care who this invisible executive was or how much money they thought they had. He demanded that the owner come out and face him man to man, promising to destroy them both financially and legally for the public humiliation they had caused his family. He stood there panting, his face covered in a sheen of angry sweat, demanding that the doors be opened immediately. The maitre d' did not flinch at the shouting. He simply raised his right hand, pressing a single finger against the discreet earpiece hidden beneath his collar. He listened for a moment, his eyes never leaving Connor's flushed face. The entire lobby seemed to hold its collective breath, the remaining relatives watching in suspended animation. The maitre d' lowered his hand and allowed a smile to break across his face. It was a cold, sharp expression that carried the distinct weight of an executioner receiving the final nod. He stepped out from behind the mahogany podium, gesturing toward the gold-plated elevator tucked away in the corner of the lobby. He spoke with deliberate enunciation. "Mr. Bradley, you are incredibly fortunate tonight. The chairman of Obsidian Estates has personally authorized your entry. She is willing to grant you an audience. Please follow me." The shift in Connor was instantaneous. The panicked desperation evaporated, replaced by a suffocating wave of renewed arrogance. He puffed out his chest, shooting a triumphant glare at the 29 relatives huddled near the revolving doors. He adjusted his bespoke suit jacket, acting as though his screaming tantrum had been a calculated masterclass in corporate negotiation. Jasmine mirrored his sudden boost in confidence, lifting her chin and clutching her designer bag as if it were a royal scepter. Vivian was the most insufferable of them all. She smoothed down the front of her ivory dress suit, tossing a look of supreme superiority over her shoulder at her horrified sisters. She loudly proclaimed that this was exactly what happens when you refuse to back down to incompetent staff. She praised Connor for showing true leadership, fully convinced that they were marching upstairs to receive a groveling apology and a deeply discounted meal from a terrified restaurant owner. The three of them strutted toward the private elevator, like conquering heroes, leaving the deeply embarrassed extended family behind. The doors slid shut, sealing them inside the mahogany-paneled cabin as they ascended to the top floor. Inside the elevator, Connor was already rehearsing his opening threats, loudly detailing exactly how many thousands of dollars he was going to demand in compensation. Jasmine agreed with every word, while Vivian checked her reflection in the mirrored walls, ensuring her diamonds caught the light perfectly for her impending victory. The elevator chimed a soft melodic note as it reached the VIP level. The doors slid open to reveal a dimly lit, breathtakingly luxurious private foyer. The air up here was completely different. It was heavy, silent, and thick with an incredibly familiar mouth-watering aroma. It did not smell like the standard French-American fare of the Sovereign. It smelled richly of dark caramelized roux, perfectly smoked hickory wood, and seasoned seafood. Vivian paused for a fraction of a second, her nose wrinkling slightly as the scent of the 12-hour smoked brisket hit her senses, but her ego quickly pushed the confusion aside. They marched forward toward the entrance of the main executive dining room. A smooth pullback shot captures the moment as the heavy oak doors of the VIP room slowly and silently push open. The dining room was a masterclass in modern, moody elegance. The crystal chandeliers had been deliberately dimmed, allowing dozens of tall, flickering taper candles to cast a warm, golden glow across the impossibly long dining table. The table itself was draped in pristine white linen and set with the restaurant's finest gold-rimmed bone china and gleaming silver flatware. But it was not the decor that drained the air from the room. Connor stormed through the threshold first, his mouth already open, a loud, aggressive threat resting right on the tip of his tongue. He was fully prepared to shout down whatever invisible corporate executive dared to cancel his reservation. But the words died in his throat. The sound caught and strangled itself, coming out as nothing more than a pathetic, choked gasp. He stopped so abruptly that Jasmine, marching right on his heels, bumped directly into his back. Jasmine let out an irritated sigh, stepping around her husband to deliver her own piece of her mind. Then she saw the head of the table. Her designer handbag slipped off her shoulder, hitting the thick carpet with a dull, heavy thud. Vivian walked in last, her face arranged in a mask of total aristocratic disdain, ready to demand the manager be fired. She looked toward the end of the long candlelit room. Her eyes widened to twice their normal size, her jaw dropping open in absolute shock. The color completely vanished from her perfectly made-up face, leaving her looking ashen and terrified. They all froze, paralyzed by a reality their minds simply could not process. Sitting at the absolute head of the massive table framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glowing Atlanta skyline was Nia. She sat back in the velvet armchair with the relaxed, terrifying posture of an apex predator who had just trapped her prey. The emerald silk suit she wore absorbed the candlelight, making her look incredibly powerful, wealthy, and entirely unreachable. She was casually holding a crystal glass of expensive red wine, swirling the dark liquid with slow, mesmerizing precision. And sitting right beside her, occupying the seat of absolute honor, was Zuri. But Zuri was no longer the heartbroken, weeping teenager they had discarded in a kitchen just hours ago. She was sitting tall, her shoulders squared, wearing a pristine, bright white chef's coat. She looked like culinary royalty, her face completely composed, devoid of any of the vulnerability or desperation for approval she had carried all morning. Arranged perfectly on the gold-rimmed plates in front of them, steam rising softly into the cool air of the VIP room, was the exact same feast Vivian had brutally rejected via text message. The seared scallops, the caviar-topped blinis, the rich dark seafood gumbo, and the tender smoked brisket. The masterpiece had been elevated from a discarded family dinner to an elite high society banquet. Vivian, Jasmine, and Connor stood frozen in the doorway, physically incapable of taking another step forward. The grand illusion of their supremacy was shattering around them in real time. They had expected to bully a stranger. They had expected to assert their dominance. Instead, they found themselves standing in the absolute center of a kingdom owned entirely by the woman they had spent their entire lives treating like dirt. The silence in the dining room was deafening, broken only by the soft clinking of the crystal glass, as Nia took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, watching them suffocate in their own profound realization. The camera perspective holds perfectly steady, just over my right shoulder, framing the three of them standing paralyzed in the grand doorway. The warm candlelight dances across the terrified features of my mother, my sister, and her arrogant husband. But the shock only lasts for a fleeting moment. Their brains are fundamentally incapable of processing the reality before them. Their entire worldview is constructed on the absolute certainty of my inferiority. Faced with visual evidence that shatters that reality, their minds instantly scramble to construct an alternative narrative, no matter how completely absurd it might be. The shock on my mother's face aggressively mutates into a twisted mask of absolute denial. Vivian steps forward, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. Her voice pitches into a shrill, hysterical register that completely destroys the elegant ambiance of the dining room. She immediately accuses me of bribing the restaurant staff. She screams that I have somehow manipulated the kitchen crew, handing them whatever meager savings I had scraped together to sneak my cheap home-cooked meals into a Michelin star establishment. She declares this is nothing more than a pathetic, vindictive prank designed specifically to ruin her milestone birthday celebration. She claims I am a jealous failure who could not stand the thought of Jasmine and Connor treating her to a life of luxury, so I resorted to juvenile sabotage. Jasmine quickly recovers from her own shock and eagerly jumps right onto our mother's delusional bandwagon. She scoffs loudly, crossing her arms and looking around the opulent dining room with extreme, exaggerated distaste. Jasmine announces that she should have known I would pull a stunt like this. She accuses me of hoarding my basic real estate commissions for years, just to rent out a private room for one night to stage a desperate illusion of success. She looks directly at Zuri, her own niece, and tells her she should be completely ashamed of herself. Jasmine sneers that Zuri is participating in a childish display instead of learning her proper place in the real world. She calls the 12-hour smoked brisket garbage and refers to the delicate caviar-topped blinis as cheap imitations of true fine dining. I feel Zuri tense beside me, her posture stiffening under the weight of her aunt's cruel words. A year ago, those exact insults would have completely crushed her spirit. Tonight, she simply looks at Jasmine with profound, silent pity. I place my hand gently over Zuri's, reminding her without speaking a single word that lions do not concern themselves with the frantic bleating of sheep. Connor finally finds his voice. The profound humiliation he had suffered down in the lobby is rapidly morphing into toxic, aggressive bravado. He struts further into the room, puffing out his chest and acting as though he is still the most powerful man in the building. He lets out a harsh, booming laugh that echoes unpleasantly against the crystal chandeliers above us. He tells me I am completely out of my mind and that my little game is officially over. He proudly states that sneaking into a locked VIP executive floor is a federal trespassing offense. He reaches into his tailored bespoke suit jacket, pulling out his gold-plated smartphone, and threatens to dial the police right that very second. He promises to have me and my daughter violently dragged out of the building in handcuffs, ensuring that my so-called pathetic little career will be utterly ruined by the impending public scandal. He boasts that his financial connections with the Atlanta Police Department will guarantee I spend the entire weekend rotting in a holding cell while he and his family sit down to enjoy their expensive dinner at my stolen table. He waves the phone in the air, demanding that I pack up my trash food and vacate the premises before he destroys my life. I do not blink. I do not flinch. I sit there in the heavy velvet armchair, listening to their frantic, desperate accusations with genuine scientific fascination. Their delusion is a spectacular psychological display. They are so deeply committed to the false narrative of my failure that they are willing to invent the most absurd conspiracy theories rather than accept the undeniable truth staring them right in the face. They honestly believe I have successfully bribed an entire executive management team, hacked a highly secure corporate reservation system, and bypassed elite private security just to serve homemade gumbo. Vivian marches up to the edge of the long dining table, slamming her palms against the pristine white linen. She demands that I stand up and leave immediately. She threatens to march back down to the lobby and have the maitre d' physically remove us using force if necessary. She tells me I am a permanent embarrassment to the family name, and that my very presence in this elite restaurant is a disgusting stain on her spotless reputation. I take another slow, deliberate sip of my wine, tasting the rich, complex notes of dark cherry and aged oak. I place the crystal glass down on the table with a soft, precise click. I look up at the three of them, letting the sheer heavy weight of my absolute silence crush their frantic, chaotic energy. I do not raise my voice. I do not need to. True power never has to shout to be heard. I simply look at Connor and tell him to go ahead and make the call. I invite him to dial the police right now and report a trespasser on the premises. I even offer to give him the direct cell phone number of the precinct captain, who happens to be a close personal friend of my corporate security director. Connor hesitates, his thumb hovering uncertainly over his illuminated screen. The absolute lack of fear in my voice makes him falter. Bullies only thrive on intimidation, and I am completely impenetrable. Jasmine nudges him sharply, urging him to make the call, wanting desperately to see me humiliated and escorted away by armed officers. But Connor is not stupid. He is incredibly arrogant, but he works in high-stakes finance. He knows that when someone calls your bluff with that level of terrifying deadpan confidence, they are usually holding an unbeatable hand. I turn my attention back to my mother. I tell her that her imagination is truly spectacular. I ask her if she honestly believes a prestigious Michelin star restaurant group would risk its entire global reputation, its highly regulated liquor license, and its corporate standing, just to let a random woman serve homemade brisket in their most exclusive private dining room. I ask her to use basic critical logic for one single solitary second. The mental gymnastics required to believe her own theory are completely astounding. Vivian violently refuses to listen. She insists that people like me always find a way to cheat the system. She claims I am just a bitter college dropout, trying to play dress up in a wealthy world I do not belong to. She looks at Zuri again and tells my daughter that she is wasting her life following in my exact footsteps, destined to be nothing more than a glorified kitchen servant for the rest of her miserable life. That is the breaking point. They can hurl insults at me all night long, but attacking my brilliant daughter in her ultimate moment of triumph is the final nail in their coffin. The time for letting them spin their pathetic, comforting delusions is officially over. I lean forward, resting my forearms on the table, intertwining my fingers with lethal precision. I look straight into my mother's terrified eyes and tell her that her profound, screaming ignorance is about to become the most expensive mistake of her entire life. I tell them they have exactly 5 seconds to shut their mouths and start listening, because their comfortable fantasy world is about to be violently and permanently dismantled. The heavy brass-handled doors leading directly into the private executive kitchen swung open with a smooth, forceful motion. If a camera were tracking the scene, it would glide perfectly alongside the sharp, confident strides of the man stepping into the dining room. It was Antoine Laurent, the world-renowned executive chef of the Sovereign. I is a culinary titan, a man whose global empire spans 3 continents, possessing 3 Michelin stars, and a terrifying reputation for being the most uncompromising, demanding perfectionist in the entire fine dining industry. He was dressed in his immaculate, stark white chef coat, an aura of absolute untouchable authority radiating from him as he moved through the dim, moody lighting of the room. Vivian spotted him instantly, and her desperate mind immediately attempted to seize control of the narrative. She stepped directly into his path, arranging her face into a deeply practiced mask of affluent distress. She began speaking rapidly, fully assuming Chef Laurent had arrived to personally evict the trespassers who had ruined her elite evening. She pointed her shaking manicured finger at me, and Zuri loudly complaining to the executive chef that we had smuggled unauthorized cheap food into his pristine establishment. She demanded that he summon his private security team immediately to have us thrown out onto the street. Connor stepped up right beside her, crossing his arms and puffing out his chest, ready to back her up and assert his supposed corporate dominance over the restaurant staff. Chef Laurent did not slow his pace. He did not offer a polite nod. He did not even blink in their general direction. He glided past Vivian and Connor, as if they were nothing more than invisible, mildly annoying pieces of furniture occupying his space. The blatant, complete disregard from a man of his immense stature left Vivian with her mouth hanging wide open, her pointing finger left dangling uselessly in the cold air. Connor dropped his arms, his chest instantly deflating, as the legendary chef completely bypassed his aggressive stance without a single ounce of hesitation. Chef Laurent walked the entire length of the massive dining table, his sharp, observant eyes locked entirely on my 18-year-old daughter. He ignored the crystal chandeliers, the opulent decor, and the suffocating family drama unfolding in the background. When he reached the head of the table where Zuri was sitting, he came to a sudden, precise stop. The entire room held its breath. Then, in a move that completely shattered the fundamental reality of my mother and sister, Chef Laurent bowed. He did not just offer a quick, polite nod of acknowledgement. He delivered a deep, genuine bow of profound professional reverence. It was the exact kind of respect a seasoned master offers only to an equal. He straightened up and addressed my daughter. His voice was rich, carrying a thick, elegant French accent that echoed perfectly across the dead silent room. He looked at her and called her Chef Zuri. Hearing that prestigious title applied to her by a culinary titan made Zuri sit up straighter, a quiet gasp escaping her lips as her hands gripped the edge of the white linen tablecloth. He told her that he had spent the last 45 minutes in the back kitchen, personally analyzing and tasting the dishes she had transported into his domain. He gestured gracefully toward the silver platters resting on the table between us. Chef Laurent began to speak about her food with absolute poetic devotion. He described the dark roux of her seafood gumbo, calling it an absolute revelation to his palate. He explained to the silent room that achieving that specific depth of flavor, that exact smoky caramelization without burning the base, requires a level of patience and raw instinct that simply cannot be taught in any elite culinary school. He moved his attention to the brisket, praising the flawless execution of the 12-hour smoke. He described the texture of the bark, the unbelievable tenderness of the meat, and the way her unique blend of spices perfectly complemented the hickory wood without ever overpowering the natural richness of the beef. He looked Zuri dead in the eye and unapologetically called her work a pure culinary masterpiece. He told her that her brilliant fusion of deep Southern soul and refined elevated technique was exactly what the modern fine dining world was desperately searching for. I watched out of the corner of my eye as Jasmine physically recoiled. She had just spent the last 10 minutes aggressively calling this exact same food garbage and a cheap imitation of fine dining. Now she was standing in stunned, humiliating silence as a 3 Michelin-star chef treated her teenage niece like a generational prodigy. Vivian looked like she was actively suffocating. Her entire argument, her sole justification for cruelly canceling the birthday dinner was that Zuri's food was not upscale enough for her so-called VIP guests. Now the highest culinary authority in the entire city was tearing her elitist delusion to absolute shreds, validating my daughter in a way Vivian could never comprehend. But Chef Laurent was not finished. He turned slightly, acknowledging me for the first time, with a highly respectful dip of his head, before turning his focused attention back to Zuri. He announced that he did not just come out into the dining room to offer his professional compliments. He came to make a formal executive request. He told Zuri that he had already contacted the chairman of Obsidian Estates, the massive parent company that owned and operated the Sovereign. He revealed to the breathless room that he had explicitly asked the chairman for permission to feature her seafood gumbo and her smoked brisket on the restaurant's highly anticipated upcoming seasonal menu. He stated clearly that he wanted to serve her exact recipes to the elite clientele who pay hundreds of dollars for a single plate in this very building. Zuri immediately covered her mouth with her hands, tears of pure, overwhelming joy springing to her eyes. The validation she had been desperately seeking all day, the love and approval her grandmother had violently and callously denied her, was now being handed to her on a silver platter by a global master chef. She did not need Vivian's conditional fake approval anymore. She had undeniable raw talent that commanded immediate respect from the absolute top of the industry. I looked at Vivian, Jasmine, and Connor. They were standing near the heavy oak doors, completely isolated and utterly irrelevant. They were no longer the guests of honor. They were uninvited spectators to my daughter's glorious coronation. The psychological destruction of their superiority complex was absolute and devastating. They were forced to stand there and watch the teenager they discarded being elevated to a magnificent status they could never hope to achieve themselves. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely, locking them out of the power dynamic. The time for letting them spin their pathetic, comforting delusions was officially over. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, intertwining my fingers with lethal precision. It was time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. I unclasped my for the pristine white linen napkin resting beside my plate. The dining room was so quiet that the simple friction of the thick fabric unfolding sounded like a crack of thunder. I dabbed the corners of my mouth with slow, agonizing deliberation. Every single eye in the room was locked onto me. If a camera were capturing this moment, it would push in tight, framing the exact second a perfectly calm, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 18 years building an empire in the shadows and was finally stepping into the blinding light. I placed the napkin down on the table, smoothing out the creases with my fingertips. I looked directly at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had violently discarded me when I was pregnant and vulnerable. "You told Zuri her food was not good enough for this restaurant," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational volume that commanded absolute attention. "You canceled her dinner because you thought homemade dishes were beneath your elite standards. But you forgot the golden rule of hospitality, Mom. The owner serves whatever she wants in her own house." Vivian blinked, her heavily mascaraed eyelashes fluttering rapidly as her brain completely short-circuited. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Jasmine tilted her head, looking at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, allowing the sheer crushing weight of my words to hang heavily over their heads. "I am the chairman," I stated clearly, articulating every single syllable, so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. "I am the founder, the CEO, and the sole shareholder of Obsidian Estates. That is the parent corporation that finalized the acquisition of the Sovereign Hospitality Group 3 months ago. I own this building. I own this restaurant. I own the very floor you are standing on right now." The physical reaction to my revelation was instantaneous and catastrophic. Vivian physically staggered backward, her expensive designer heels catching on the plush carpet. She had to reach out and grab the back of a heavy velvet dining chair just to keep herself from collapsing to the floor. Her pristine country club facade melted away instantly, leaving behind the terrified ashen face of a woman who suddenly realized she had just brutally insulted the most powerful person in the room. Her entire social currency, the status she had spent decades meticulously cultivating, was absolutely worthless compared to my actual capital. Jasmine turned a sickening shade of gray. The golden child, the Ivy League graduate who had spent her entire life looking down her nose at me, was suddenly faced with the undeniable fact that her so-called pathetic older sister possessed a level of wealth and corporate authority she could not even comprehend. Her entire identity was built on the fundamental belief that she was the successful daughter. Watching that core belief shatter into a million pieces right in front of her eyes was a spectacle of pure poetic justice. I did not stop there. I needed them to understand the full, terrifying magnitude of their mistake. I leaned back into my velvet armchair, projecting absolute unbothered dominance. Obsidian Estates is not a small holding company, I explained, watching their eyes widen with every word. We own prime commercial real estate across the entire East Coast. We own the luxury high-rises you attend charity galas in. We own the boutique shopping districts where you buy your overpriced handbags. And as of recently, we own the most exclusive Michelin star dining establishments in Atlanta. While you were busy curating a fake image of wealth for your church friends and your country club acquaintances, I was busy buying the actual deeds to the properties you lease. I looked at Zuri sitting beside me in her bright white chef coat. She was beaming, radiating a fierce, undeniable pride. She finally understood why I had not yelled or cried when the text message arrived. She realized that her mother was a titan and that she was completely untouchable in this kingdom. I turned my attention back to Vivian. You kicked me out because you said I would ruin the family legacy. I reminded her, my voice devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. You told everyone I was a failure who would amount to nothing. You spent nearly 2 decades spinning a comfortable lie to protect your own fragile ego. You told yourself I was struggling because it made you feel superior. But the truth is, I let you believe that lie because it kept you out of my way. It gave me the silence and the space I needed to build a multi-million-dollar fortress around my daughter. I did not need your conditional love because I was too busy building generational wealth. Connor finally managed to break free from his paralysis. The arrogant finance director simply could not let a black woman completely dominate him without putting up a fight. His massive ego simply would not allow it. He shook his head violently, letting out a harsh, breathless laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. That is a complete bluff, he stammered, taking a step forward, but keeping a very safe distance from the table. There is absolutely no way a college dropout built a real estate conglomerate without institutional backing. Obsidian Estates is a massive private equity firm. I know the market. I know the players. If you were the CEO, I would have seen your name on the board of directors. You are lying. You probably just know the manager and convinced him to play along with this ridiculous charade. I looked at Connor with a mixture of profound pity and absolute predatory amusement. He was so blinded by his own systemic privilege and financial arrogance that he could not recognize the executioner standing right in front of him. I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I did not pull out my phone to show him my bank accounts or my corporate filings. True wealth does not need to justify itself to middle management. I simply smiled again, letting the chilling silence stretch out until the sheer force of my confidence made him visibly sweat. I told Connor that he was right about one thing. Obsidian Estates is indeed a massive private equity firm, but I told him he was dead wrong about knowing the market, and he was about to find out exactly how much he did not know. If a camera were capturing this exact moment, the entire frame would abruptly tilt into a sharp, severe Dutch angle. The slanted perspective would perfectly mirror the sudden visual instability of the room as Connor desperately attempted to forcibly realign the shifting power dynamics. He threw his head back and let out a booming, grating laugh that shattered the quiet elegance of the VIP dining room. It was not a laugh of genuine amusement. It was a loud, aggressive weaponization of his own entitlement designed specifically to shrink me down to size. It was the laugh of a man dripping with white privilege and financial arrogance, completely accustomed to dominating every single room he walked into, simply by virtue of his demographics and his corporate title. Connor adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke navy suit, squaring his shoulders, as he took 2 deliberate steps toward the massive dining table. The panicked sweat that had gathered on his forehead in the lobby was gone, replaced by a toxic, aggressive swagger. He looked down his nose at me, his lips curled into a condescending smirk. He told me that my little performance was almost impressive, but ultimately pathetic. He confidently declared that I had made a catastrophic miscalculation by choosing the sovereign for my delusional game of billionaire dress-up. He leaned his hands on the back of an empty velvet chair, locking his gaze onto mine. He decided to explain how the real world worked using a slow, patronizing tone normally reserved for talking to a slow child. He boasted that his real estate investment fund had recently acquired a massive distressed debt portfolio. He proudly announced to the entire room that his firm held the primary debt notes for this specific hospitality group. He claimed that because his company controlled the financial leverage, he was the true owner of this building. He stated that the restaurant management answered directly to him and his board of directors, not to some imaginary holding company run by a college dropout. Hearing this blatant display of corporate chest puffing, Jasmine immediately regained her haughty posture. The absolute terror that had gripped her just moments ago completely evaporated. She moved to stand right behind her husband, resting her manicured hand on his shoulder, casting a sickeningly triumphant glare in my direction. Vivian also breathed a massive visible sigh of relief. The aristocratic mask slid perfectly back onto our mother's face. In their minds, the natural order of the universe had been rightfully restored. The wealthy finance executive was putting the rebellious independent black woman firmly back in her proper place. They truly believed Connor had just checkmated me with his superior knowledge of high-level commercial finance. Connor was practically glowing with self-satisfaction. He pointed a finger at me, treating me like a common trespasser who had snuck in through the service elevator. He loudly declared that I was committing corporate fraud. He insisted that Obsidian Estates was nothing more than a dummy corporation I had invented to sound important. He told Zuri that she needed to pack up her garbage food immediately because her mother was about to be arrested for trespassing and criminal impersonation. He turned his aggressive attention toward Chef Laurent, who was still standing respectfully near the head of the table. Connor barked a direct order at the culinary master, demanding that he summon the restaurant security team right this second. He threatened that if I was not physically dragged out of the executive dining room, within the next 2 minutes, he would make a single phone call to his partners and initiate an immediate hostile takeover of the restaurant group. He promised to liquidate the assets, sell the building for scrap, and personally ensure that Chef Laurent never worked in the city of Atlanta ever again. I did not interrupt his unhinged monologue. I sat perfectly still in my chair, allowing him to dig his own grave with a backhoe. I let him showcase his profound ignorance to the entire room. The more he spoke, the more he revealed his absolute lack of basic due diligence. A smart financial director would have double-checked the ownership records before making such wild, aggressive threats. But Connor was not smart. He was just loud. He relied entirely on intimidation and the assumption that no one would ever dare challenge his authority. When he finally ran out of breath, he stood there smirking, waiting for me to break down, crying or beg for mercy. He waited for me to apologize and scurry out the back door in total disgrace. I did not say a single word. I did not even look at him. I simply raised my right hand into the air, keeping my elbow resting casually on the arm of my velvet chair. I pressed my thumb and middle finger together. I snapped my fingers. The single sharp sound cut through the heavy silence of the dining room like a gunshot. It was a crisp, defining crack that instantly wiped the arrogant smile right off Connor's face. He blinked, looking around the room in sudden confusion, unsure of what that simple gesture meant. He did not have to wait long to find out. From the deep shadows, near the private entrance of the suite, a figure stepped forward. It was Marcus, my executive assistant. He moved with the silent, lethal grace of a highly trained corporate operative. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit, his face an absolute mask of professional indifference. He did not look at Vivian. He did not look at Jasmine. He walked with unbroken purpose directly toward the side of the table where Connor was standing. Marcus carried a massive, incredibly thick legal folder. It was bound in heavy manila stock and sealed tightly with bright red tamper-evident security tape. The sheer physical size of the document indicated that it contained an overwhelming amount of deeply complex financial data. Marcus reached the empty place setting directly in front of Connor. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not say a single word to the arrogant man standing there. Marcus simply raised his arm and dropped the massive sealed legal folder directly onto the pristine gold-rimmed bone china plate. The heavy thud of the thick paper striking the delicate porcelain echoed violently through the entire room, making Jasmine physically jump backward in shock. The trap had officially been sprung, and the heavy steel jaws were about to snap completely shut around Connor's entire life. Connor stared down at the thick manila folder resting on the gold-rimmed china plate in front of him. For a fraction of a second, his brain tried to rationalize the sudden intrusion. He tried to maintain his aggressive posture, puffing his chest out and scoffing loudly, as if Marcus had just handed him a meaningless menu. He reached out with his right hand, acting as though he were simply humoring a pathetic bluff. His fingers grasped the bright red tamper evidence security tape binding the document shut. A sudden rapid visual shift acts as a quick zoom, rushing forward to focus entirely on his hands as he rips the seal open and flips back the heavy cover. His eyes darted to the top of the first page. The bold black legal typography seemed to leap off the crisp white paper. It was not a deed to the restaurant. It was not a corporate lease agreement. It was a formal legally binding foreclosure notice and a notice of default and seizure. The document was explicitly addressed to the primary executive board of his specific real estate investment fund. The arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face, as if it had been physically wiped away. It was replaced instantly by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw went slack and his eyes widened in absolute horror as they darted frantically back and forth across the dense legal text. He tried to read the paragraphs faster, desperately searching for a loophole or a mistake, but the financial terminology was absolutely watertight. His hands began to tremble so violently that the thick pages rattled loudly against the delicate porcelain plate beneath them. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death certificate. Jasmine noticed the catastrophic shift in her husband's demeanor immediately. She stepped closer to his side, leaning over his shoulder to look at the documents. She expected to see a fake lease or a forged contract she could easily mock. Instead, she saw the seal of the federal bankruptcy court and the name of their own investment firm stamped across the top. She gasped, grabbing his arm and asking him what this meant. Connor could not answer her. He could not form a single coherent word. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster unfolding in front of his eyes. I sat perfectly still in my velvet armchair, watching his total psychological destruction with cold, calculated satisfaction. I let him choke on his own panic for several long, agonizing seconds before I finally spoke. My voice sliced through the heavy silence of the dining room, sharp and precise like a scalpel. I told him he was looking at the end of his entire career. I calmly explained that he had walked into this room boasting about holding the debt portfolio for the restaurant group, believing that gave him ultimate power. But I revealed that the thick file sitting on his plate was not the restaurant's debt. It was his. I watched him physically flinch as I dropped the next bomb. I told the room that Obsidian Estates did not just finalize the purchase of the Sovereign Hospitality Group 3 months ago. We had also been conducting a massive aggressive forensic audit of the local commercial financial sector. I explained that I knew exactly how he operated his fund. I knew that he routinely over-leveraged his clients' assets, relying on aggressive borrowing to mask his catastrophic losses in the market. I knew that his firm was secretly drowning in highly toxic bad debt that he had been desperately trying to hide from his board of directors and his investors. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the white linen tablecloth, locking my gaze directly onto his terrified face. I told him that yesterday morning, right as the financial markets opened, my corporate acquisitions team executed a highly targeted maneuver. We did not just buy the restaurant. We went directly to his primary lenders and purchased the entirety of his firm's toxic debt portfolio. We bought every single defaulted loan, every over-leveraged commercial mortgage, and every high-risk promissory note his firm owed. Connor stumbled backward, his legs literally giving out beneath him. He hit the back of a dining chair and gripped it desperately to keep from collapsing onto the floor. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He knew exactly what my words meant. In the ruthless world of high finance, the person who owns the debt holds the leash. By aggressively buying out his lenders, Obsidian Estates had officially become the primary senior creditor of his entire investment fund. I was no longer just the woman he had mocked in the lobby. I was his absolute master. I kept my voice deadly calm, delivering the killing blow with surgical precision. I explained the legal reality of the documents resting on the plate before him. Because his firm was already in severe violation of their liquidity covenants, the transfer of the debt triggered an immediate acceleration clause. I informed him that the foreclosure notice demanded payment in full for the entire multi-million-dollar debt portfolio within exactly 48 hours. If he could not produce the capital to clear the balance, my company possessed the immediate legal right to seize his assets, liquidate his entire firm, and permanently shutter his business operations. I glanced over at Zuri, who was watching the scene unfold with quiet awe. She was witnessing firsthand the true definition of power. She was seeing that true strength does not require screaming in a lobby or degrading service workers. It requires intellect preparation and the patience to strike precisely when your opponent is most vulnerable. I wanted her to remember this moment forever. I wanted her to know that no one in this family would ever be allowed to dismiss her or treat her like an afterthought again. The days of suffering their cruelty in silence were permanently erased by the mountain of legal documents currently shattering Connor's existence. Vivian stood frozen near the doorway, completely incapable of understanding the complex financial execution taking place. She only understood the raw, terrifying power dynamic. She saw the wealthy son-in-law she worshipped reduced to a trembling, hyperventilating mess by the daughter she had always treated like dirt. The realization that I possessed the capital, the strategy, and the absolute ruthlessness to completely dismantle a multi-million-dollar investment firm before breakfast was finally penetrating her stubborn, aristocratic delusion. I looked at Connor and told him that his arrogant threats in the lobby were completely pathetic. He had threatened to buy my restaurant and fire my staff. I told him I did not need to make empty threats because I had already bought his entire company, and I was going to systematically burn it to the ground. The heavy steel jaws of my trap had snapped entirely shut, and there was absolutely no way out. I did not let the deafening silence linger for more than a few seconds before motioning to the heavy oak doors at the back of the dining room. If a camera were capturing the scene, it would execute a slow, agonizing pan across the threshold as the heavy mahogany doors were pushed entirely open. Standing there huddled together in a state of absolute disbelief were the 29 relatives who had previously worshipped the ground Connor walked on. I had instructed my security team to silently escort my aunts, uncles, and cousins up the private freight elevator the moment Connor swiped his dead credit card. I did not just want to destroy the arrogant finance director in a vacuum. I wanted every single member of this status-obsessed family to bear witness to the absolute fraud they had been bowing down to all these years. The slow pan across their faces would reveal a stunning mosaic of pure shock and creeping horror. My aunt, who had just praised Connor's flawless financial acumen, was clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles were turning white. My cousin, the corporate lawyer, looked physically nauseated as his trained legal mind instantly recognized the severe implications of the red tamper-evident tape resting on the table. They all stood frozen in the opulent doorway, watching their golden boy hyperventilate over a foreclosure notice. Vivian tried to step in front of them, attempting to physically block their view of the disaster, but it was far too late. The curtain had been violently ripped away, and the pathetic reality of her perfect son-in-law was exposed for the entire congregation to see. I turned my attention back to Connor, who was still gripping the edge of the dining chair like a drowning man holding onto a life preserver. I told him that buying his toxic debt portfolio was just the preliminary phase of my acquisition strategy. I explained that when my forensic accounting team penetrated his firm's highly secure digital ledgers, they found something far more interesting than simple bad investments. I projected my voice, ensuring that every single aunt and uncle standing near the doorway could hear every single syllable with crystal clarity. I announced that Connor was not just a terrible investor. He was an active, reckless criminal. I detailed exactly how his entire pristine financial empire was built on a foundation of massive illegal deception. I revealed that 6 months ago, he had made a catastrophic gamble on highly volatile cryptocurrency markets using heavily leveraged margin accounts. When the digital markets inevitably crashed, he was left facing a tidal wave of margin calls that would have immediately bankrupted his firm and exposed his extreme incompetence. Instead of taking the loss and admitting his failure to his partners, He decided to cross a line that guaranteed he would spend the next decade in federal prison. I looked directly at my horrified relatives as I dropped the heaviest anchor of the night. I told them that to cover his massive cryptocurrency losses, Connor had systematically and deliberately embezzled millions of dollars from his own clients. He did not just steal from faceless corporations. I read directly from the executive summary resting on the table, outlining how he had illegally siphoned capital from elderly clients' retirement accounts, educational trust funds, and even the primary operational accounts of the very charities Vivian constantly bragged about funding. He had secretly wired their protected assets into offshore accounts to desperately patch the bleeding holes in his crypto portfolios. The collective gasp from the 29 relatives echoed loudly against the crystal chandeliers. Several of the older aunts actually had to lean against the velvet-paneled walls to steady themselves. They realized in a sickening rush that the lavish lifestyle, Connor had been flaunting the expensive suits, the luxury cars, and this very attempt to buy out a Michelin star restaurant was all being funded by stolen money. He was entirely, completely broke. His entire net worth was a negative multi-million-dollar black hole of stolen assets and fraudulent ledgers. Jasmine let out a sharp, terrified cry, stepping away from her husband, as if he were suddenly highly contagious. She looked at him, demanding that he deny the accusations, begging him to tell the family that I was making it all up. Connor could not even look her in the eye. He just stared blankly at the dark mahogany table, his chest heaving, his perfectly styled hair now matted to his sweating forehead. His utter inability to defend himself was the most damning confession possible. The golden child realized in that exact moment that the wealthy prince she had married was actually a desperate, desperate thief who had just dragged her into a massive criminal conspiracy. I did not offer them a single ounce of sympathy. I leaned back into my chair, radiating cold, absolute authority. I informed Connor that my corporate legal team did not just draft a foreclosure notice. We operate with strict adherence to federal financial regulations. I told him that the second my auditors uncovered the unauthorized wire transfers and the blatant embezzlement of trust funds, we immediately compiled a comprehensive forensic dossier. We did not keep this information internal. I explained that less than 12 hours ago, my chief legal counsel handed that exact dossier directly over to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The mention of federal authorities struck the room like a physical blow. I watched the remaining shreds of Connor's arrogance instantly vaporize into pure, unadulterated dread. I told him that the federal investigations were not just looming, they were already actively underway. I promised him that by Monday morning, federal agents would be marching into his glass-walled corporate office with sealed warrants, seizing his servers, freezing his personal bank accounts, and placing him under federal indictment for massive wire fraud and grand larceny. He was not just losing his business and his social status tonight. He was losing his freedom entirely. Vivian let out a strangled, horrific sob, burying her face in her hands. The pristine, untouchable image she had spent decades meticulously crafting was burning to ash right there on the imported Italian marble. She had sold her soul, rejected her own flesh and blood, and worshipped a man who was actively stealing from her own community. I looked at the 29 relatives watching the absolute destruction of the family hierarchy. They had followed Vivian into this building expecting to be treated to a display of immense wealth. Instead, they were receiving a masterclass in ultimate accountability. The false king had been entirely dethroned and stripped bare in front of his entire court. Jasmine let out a piercing shriek that shattered the last remnants of dignity in the dining room. She lunged forward and grabbed Connor by the lapels of his custom-bespoke suit, violently shaking him. She demanded that he speak up and tell the entire family that this was all a massive lie. She ordered him to fix the situation immediately, relying on the blind faith she had always placed in his white privilege and corporate authority. But Connor was completely broken. He did not offer her a single word of reassurance. He was physically hyperventilating, his chest heaving erratically as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The terrifying reality of federal prison had completely paralyzed his vocal cords, leaving him gasping for air, while his wife completely unraveled right in front of him. The visual contrast between us in that exact moment was absolute poetry. Jasmine was frantic, manic, and entirely stripped of her manufactured elite composure. Her designer handbag lay forgotten on the floor, and her perfectly styled hair was coming undone as she frantically clawed at her husband's jacket. I remained perfectly seated at the head of the long candle-lit table, unbothered and immovable. I took another slow sip of my red wine, watching her pathetic display with cold detachment. I did not move a single muscle to comfort her. The undisputed golden child of the family, the woman who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, was experiencing her very first taste of genuine catastrophic failure. I shifted my gaze directly onto my sister. I called her name, letting the sharp single syllable cut right through her hysterical sobbing. Jasmine snapped her head toward me, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and overflowing with panicked tears. She pointed a shaking manicured finger in my direction and screamed that I had ruined her life. She accused me of being a jealous, vindictive monster who could never stand to see her happy. She loudly insisted to the relatives still hovering in the doorway that even if her husband made a few careless financial mistakes, her own personal wealth and her pristine social standing remained completely untouchable. I let out a soft, chilling laugh that echoed against the crystal chandeliers above us. I told her that her profound ignorance regarding her own financial reality was truly staggering. I asked her to recall the massive, sprawling $3 million suburban mansion she loved to brag about at every single family gathering. I reminded her of how she constantly flaunted the imported Italian marble countertops, the custom wine cellar, and the infinity pool, treating that property like a permanent monument to her undeniable superiority over me. I watched her chest rise and fall rapidly as she defensively claimed that her house was fully protected and completely shielded from whatever corporate disaster Connor had created. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the pristine white linen, and crushed her delusion into fine dust. I informed her that her husband was so blindingly desperate for liquid capital 6 months ago that he needed a massive infusion of cash to cover his sinking cryptocurrency margins. Because his credit was already severely overextended, he required high-value physical collateral to secure a high-risk corporate bridge loan. I looked right into Jasmine's terrified eyes and told her that Connor had secretly forged her signature on the deed transfers, leveraging the very roof over her head to feed his insatiable gambling addiction. Jasmine whipped her head around to face Connor, her voice breaking as she begged him to deny my accusation. She pleaded with him to tell her that their beautiful home was safe. Connor just hung his head, staring blankly at the dark mahogany wood floor, utterly unable to meet his wife's desperate gaze. His silent confirmation hit Jasmine like a physical blow to the stomach. She stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the heavy oak table, gasping for air as the floor dropped out from beneath her entire existence. But the absolute worst part of my revelation was still waiting to be delivered. I told Jasmine that when Obsidian Estates systematically bought out all of Connor's toxic debt portfolios from his lenders, we did not just acquire his business loans. We acquired every single piece of collateral legally attached to those defaulted notes. I stated with brutal crystalline clarity that her pristine $3 million suburban palace now legally belonged entirely to my holding company. I owned her front door. I owned her custom wine cellar. I owned the very ground she slept on. I did not give her a single second to catch her breath or formulate a response. I informed her that my corporate legal department had already drafted and finalized the necessary foreclosure paperwork. I told her that at exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning, a team of armed county sheriffs would arrive at the front gate of her exclusive gated community. They would post a formal notice of immediate eviction directly onto her custom mahogany front door. I explained that she would have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever clothing she could fit into a suitcase before my private security contractors arrived to change all the locks and seize the remaining property inside the house. Jasmine collapsed hard into one of the velvet dining chairs, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The wealthy elite princess of the family had been instantly reduced to an impending homeless liability. The luxurious life she had spent decades holding over my head, using it to make me feel small and insignificant, had been legally and ruthlessly erased by a single signature from my pen. She was completely destitute, legally tied to a federal criminal, and about to be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing to her name. Vivian watched her golden child completely disintegrate and let out a horrified, agonizing wail. The mother who had built her entire social identity around Jasmine's prestigious marriage and massive house was now watching her ultimate investment turn to ash. Vivian realized that she could no longer brag to her church committees or her country club friends about her successful daughter. Jasmine was going to be the subject of massive public scandal and crushing humiliation. I looked at Jasmine's weeping form and felt absolutely no remorse. She had stood in my kitchen just hours ago, sneering at my brilliant daughter and calling her hard work garbage. She had spent 18 years acting as our mother's enthusiastic accomplice, actively participating in my marginalization and feeding off my pain. She had always believed that playing by Vivian's rules made her completely invincible. Now she was finally paying the ultimate devastating price for her cruelty and her blind, arrogant complicity. If a camera were positioned at the base of the massive dining table pointing upward, it would capture the exact moment I finally pushed back my velvet chair and stood up. The low-angle perspective would emphasize the sheer commanding authority radiating from my posture as I rose to my full height. The emerald silk of my tailored suit caught the flickering candlelight, creating a sharp, striking contrast against the dark wood and heavy shadows of the room. I towered over the absolute wreckage of the family hierarchy. Connor was still slouched over the table, gasping for oxygen like a dying fish, while Jasmine remained collapsed in her chair, weeping uncontrollably into her shaking hands. But my focus shifted entirely to the grand architect of this toxic dynasty. Vivian looked up at me, and for the very first time in my entire 38 years of existence, I saw genuine, unadulterated awe and terror in my mother's eyes. The harsh reality of her complete financial and social annihilation finally broke the last remaining strings of her pride. The woman who had spent decades meticulously crafting an image of untouchable upper-class perfection suddenly let out a ragged, desperate sob. She stepped forward and her legs simply gave out beneath her. Vivian collapsed, dropping straight down onto her knees. The expensive fabric of her pristine ivory dress suit pooled around her on the thick restaurant carpet. The heavy diamond necklace she had flaunted so proudly in the lobby now hung awkwardly from her neck like a glittering heavy chain weighing her down to the floor. She reached her hands out toward me, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling violently under the dim lights. She began to beg. The sound of my mother pleading was entirely foreign to my ears. It was a pathetic, broken sound that echoed loudly against the crystal chandeliers. She begged me to remember that we were family. She cried that blood is thicker than water, and that God commands us to forgive our relatives in times of desperate need. She pleaded with me to use my massive wealth to pay off the federal authorities to clear the stolen funds from Connor's fraudulent accounts and to stop the eviction on Jasmine's suburban mansion. She wailed that if this scandal went public, our entire family name would be completely permanently ruined within the Atlanta church community and her elite social circles. She looked up at me with mascara-stained tears streaming down her carefully contoured face, demanding that I fulfill my duty as a daughter to save her from absolute public disgrace. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely no warmth, no pity, and no obligation. I kept my voice perfectly flat, stripping it of any emotion whatsoever. I told her that she had no right to invoke the sanctity of blood. I reminded her that blood did not matter to her 18 years ago, when she threw her pregnant 20-year-old daughter out into the freezing rain to protect her fragile social standing in the neighborhood. I reminded her that blood did not matter just a few hours ago when she callously sent a text message discarding her own granddaughter's magnificent culinary efforts simply because she wanted to show off at a high-end restaurant. I told her that blood is only thicker than water when it is actively pumping through a living, beating heart, but the heart of this family had been completely dead for decades. I took a slow, deliberate step back, ensuring she could not touch the hem of my suit. I told her that I would not spend a single solitary cent of my hard-earned corporate capital to save a racist, arrogant thief from a federal prison sentence. I told her that Jasmine would have to learn how to survive in the real world without a stolen trust fund to finance her designer wardrobe. And I told Vivian that her precious reputation in the country club was already dead the moment Connor decided to steal from the elderly to cover his gambling losses. I refused to be the financial savior for the very people who had actively prayed for my downfall and actively celebrated my struggles. The 29 relatives huddled near the heavy oak doors watched this exchange in absolute horrified silence. The mighty matriarch of the family had been completely broken, brought to her knees by the daughter she had always deemed a failure. The spectacle was a brutal, undeniable testament to the shifting power dynamics. I turned my head slightly toward the doorway, where the maitre d' had been standing silently observing the complete destruction of the fraudulent guests. I raised my right hand and gave him a single sharp nod. He immediately understood the assignment. He stepped forward holding a sleek black leather check presenter, resting perfectly on a polished silver tray. He walked with the fluid, dignified grace of a seasoned professional, completely ignoring the weeping golden child and the hyperventilating finance director. He bypassed Connor entirely, knowing that the man was now legally and financially radioactive. The maitre d' stopped directly in front of my mother, who was still kneeling on the carpet. He lowered the silver tray, presenting the black leather folder to her with a polite professional bow. Vivian stared at the leather book as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She slowly reached up with a shaking hand and opened the cover. Her breath hitched audibly as she read the printed receipt tucked inside the folder. I looked down at her and delivered the final absolute checkmate of the evening. I explained the basic mathematics of the situation using the same condescending tone she had used on me for my entire life. I told her that because she had abruptly canceled a home-cooked birthday party to drag 29 relatives to a Michelin star establishment demanding exclusive entry without a valid reservation, the costs were quite substantial. I detailed that the immediate last-minute buyout of an entire VIP executive floor, combined with the aggressive disruption of my private tasting and the severe inconvenience to my hospitality staff, carried a premium penalty. I stated clearly that the total cancellation and buyout fee for the evening was exactly $45,000. I watched her eyes bulge as the massive number registered in her panicked brain. I reminded her that she could not rely on her wealthy son-in-law to cover the expense tonight. I announced to the silent room that Connor's black card had been permanently frozen by the federal government, and every single asset he claimed to own was currently in the process of being seized by my holding company. He was entirely worthless. Jasmine was entirely broke. The massive, devastating bill rested solely on the shoulders of the woman who had demanded this luxurious venue in the first place. I leaned forward slightly, looking directly into the terrified eyes of the woman who had always called me a failure. I asked her the single most humiliating question she would ever have to answer in her entire life. Will you be paying with a check or cash, Mom? Vivian remained perfectly still on the imported carpet. Her eyes were completely vacant, staring down at the sleek black leather folder resting in her trembling hands. The staggering $45,000 figure printed on that crisp white receipt was not just a restaurant bill. It was the exact numerical value of her ultimate destruction. She opened her mouth, attempting to formulate a coherent response, but only a dry, raspy wheeze escaped her throat. The imposing matriarch, who had spent the last 3 decades dictating the lives of everyone around her, was entirely out of words. She looked desperately toward Connor, praying that the wealthy son-in-law would somehow miraculously recover his composure and conjure a financial miracle. But Connor was gone. The arrogant finance director who had threatened to buy the entire building just 30 minutes ago was now sitting slouched in a velvet dining chair, openly sobbing. Great heaving gasps racked his chest as thick tears streamed down his face, ruining his perfectly manicured appearance. He dragged his hands through his expensive haircut, pulling at the roots, as the sheer terrifying reality of his impending federal indictment crushed the last fragments of his sanity. The loud, pathetic sounds of his weeping echoed through the silent dining room, stripping away any illusion of his corporate superiority. Jasmine snapped. The realization that her husband was a desperate broke criminal who had gambled away her $3 million mansion shattered her fragile mind. She turned on Connor with a ferocious, unhinged fury, screaming at the top of her lungs and hitting his chest. She shrieked about her impending eviction and the absolute public humiliation she was about to suffer. Her screaming mixed with Connor's pathetic sobbing, creating a chaotic, miserable soundtrack to their total downfall. The 29 relatives clustered near the mahogany doors watched the implosion with absolute horror. My cousin, the corporate lawyer, shook his head in pure disgust and walked straight out the door. The older aunts, who usually hung on Vivian's every word, began slowly backing away. Vivian watched her precious audience abandon her, realizing her carefully curated reputation was permanently destroyed. I did not linger to watch the rest of their pathetic display. I had accomplished exactly what I set out to do. I had protected my child and completely dismantled the toxic hierarchy that had suffocated me for 18 years. I turned my back on the weeping finance director, the screaming golden child, and the utterly humiliated matriarch. I looked down at my beautiful 18-year-old daughter sitting proudly in her pristine white chef coat. Zuri was no longer the heartbroken teenager crying in our kitchen over discarded seafood. She was radiant, glowing with the undeniable confidence of a culinary prodigy who had just been validated by the highest authority in the fine dining industry. I reached out and gently took her hand, giving it a firm, reassuring squeeze. I told her it was time to go home. Zuri stood up tall, her shoulders squared, carrying herself with absolute grace. Together we turned and began our exit. If a camera were capturing this moment, it would execute a smooth, steady tracking shot, following right alongside us as we confidently walked away from the massive dining table. We did not look back. We did not offer a single word of goodbye or closure to the toxic wreckage struggling on the floor behind us. We simply walked forward, leaving the bill resting on the table and the heavy burden of our familial obligation permanently shattered in our wake. As we approached the heavy oak doors, the remaining relatives parted like the Red Sea. They cleared a wide, respectful path, pressing their backs against the wood-paneled walls. They looked at me with a profound level of genuine fear. I simply glided through the corridor, the emerald silk of my tailored suit swishing quietly. We stepped out of the private dining room and into the dimly lit foyer. The maitre d' stood perfectly straight and offered a deeply respectful bow acknowledging my authority. We stepped inside the mirrored elevator cabin, and the heavy brass doors slid silently shut, cutting off the faint distant sounds of Jasmine screaming on the floor above us. The ride down was perfectly smooth. When the doors opened, the bustling energy of the restaurant washed over us. Patrons were laughing and enjoying expensive meals, entirely unaware of the massive financial execution that had just taken place above them. Zuri and I walked through the imported Italian marble lobby, our heads held high, moving with the effortless grace of two women who completely owned the world they were stepping into. We exited through the heavy glass revolving doors, stepping out into the warm, humid Atlanta evening air. The city lights glowed brightly against the dark night sky, casting long, elegant shadows across the pristine pavement. Waiting perfectly positioned directly at the curb was my personal chauffeured Maybach. The sleek black vehicle gleamed under the streetlights, radiating quiet, undeniable wealth. My driver, a professional, discreet man named Thomas, immediately stepped out and opened the heavy armored rear door for us. He offered a polite nod, waiting patiently, as Zuri climbed into the luxurious leather interior, followed closely by me. I settled into the plush, spacious back seat, letting the supreme comfort of the vehicle wrap around me. Thomas gently closed the heavy door, sealing us inside the quiet cabin. I looked out the tinted window, staring at the glowing neon sign of the Sovereign one last time. Inside that building, the people who had spent decades trying to break my spirit were currently drowning in the miserable ruins of their own making. They were bankrupt, humiliated, and facing total destruction. I had survived their cruelty, built my empire in the dark, and returned to completely conquer their world. Thomas shifted the Maybach into gear, and the powerful engine purred softly as we pulled away, driving into the bright, beautiful future that belonged entirely to us. The morning sun crested over the lush canopy of the Buckhead district, casting long golden shadows across my private estate. If a camera were capturing the dawn, it would utilize a sweeping dramatic drone shot descending slowly from the sky, revealing a sprawling, ultra-luxurious modern compound hidden entirely behind towering stone walls and massive wrought iron security gates. The estate was a sanctuary of pristine landscaping, cascading water features, and sleek architectural glass designed specifically to keep the noise of the outside world firmly at bay. Inside the master suite, I woke up to absolute perfect silence. I reached for my personal phone resting on the marble nightstand and tapped the screen. The display lit up, revealing exactly 87 missed calls. They were primarily from Vivian, with a frantic handful from Jasmine. My voicemail box was completely full of desperate, rambling audio messages left throughout the early hours of the morning. I did not listen to a single one of them. I tossed the phone onto the bed and walked into my expansive master bathroom. I took my time enjoying a hot shower and dressing in a comfortable but undeniably expensive cashmere lounge set. When I walked downstairs into the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed espresso filled the air. Zuri was already sitting at the massive quartz island, scrolling through her Culinary Academy orientation materials on her tablet. She looked rested, happy, and entirely unburdened. We shared a quiet, peaceful morning routine, completely insulated from the catastrophic fallout happening on the other side of town. At exactly 8:15 in the morning, the integrated smart home security system chimed a soft, melodic alert. The high-definition display screen mounted on the kitchen wall flickered to life. The feed switched automatically to the primary perimeter camera stationed at the main entrance of my estate. I walked over to the screen with my coffee mug in hand. Standing right outside my imposing 20-foot iron security gates was Vivian. The visual transformation of my mother was absolutely staggering. The impeccable, aristocratic matriarch who had strutted into the sovereign the night before was completely gone. In her place stood a frantic, exhausted woman who looked entirely broken. She was still wearing the exact same ivory dress suit from the restaurant, but it was deeply wrinkled and stained. Her carefully styled hair was a disheveled mess, sticking to her forehead with nervous sweat. Her expensive makeup was smeared under her eyes, leaving dark, hollow circles that exposed her true age and her absolute panic. She was aggressively mashing her finger against the glowing call button of my security intercom, looking wildly up at the cameras. She had clearly spent the entire night tracking down my primary residence, leveraging whatever social connections she had left to find my hidden address. I tapped the screen, activating the exterior audio feed, but keeping my own microphone firmly muted. Vivian's voice flooded into my pristine kitchen. Her tone was completely stripped of its usual haughty superiority. She was practically hyperventilating, gripping the iron bars of the gate with both hands, shaking them, as if she could somehow force her way onto my property through sheer desperation. "Nia, please answer me," she begged, her voice cracking loudly, echoing pathetically down the private tree-lined street. "I know you are in there. Please, you have to listen to me. You cannot do this to us. You cannot do this to your sister. Jasmine has been crying all night long. Connor is locked in the bathroom having a panic attack. The federal investigators left a message with his secretary this morning. They are freezing everything. Nia, you have to stop this right now." I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching her unravel in stunning high definition. Vivian pressed her face closer to the intercom box, her desperation reaching a fever pitch. "You have the money, Nia," she wailed, tears streaming down her face. "I know you have the money to fix this. You can pay off his debt to the bank. You can withdraw the foreclosure on the house. You can call your lawyers and make the federal agents go away. Jasmine is your sister, Nia. You cannot throw her out onto the street with absolutely nothing. Think about the family name. Think about our standing in the church." Her voice grew even more frantic as she began to outline the true source of her terror. "If the congregation finds out Connor is a thief, our reputation will be completely destroyed. The bishop will ask us to step down from the charity boards. My friends at the country club will never speak to me again. We will be total laughingstocks in Atlanta. Please, Nia, I am begging you as your mother. You have to save us from this scandal. Blood is thicker than water." The sheer audacity of her pleas was almost fascinating to witness. Even standing at the absolute rock bottom of her existence, Vivian was entirely incapable of genuine remorse. Her entire desperate monologue did not contain a single apology for how she had treated Zuri. It did not contain a single ounce of regret for the 18 years she spent labeling me a total failure. Her only concern was protecting Jasmine's unearned lifestyle, shielding a white-collar criminal from federal prison, and preserving her own fragile artificial status within her elite church community. She was begging me to use the very wealth she had relentlessly mocked to rescue the exact people who had spent their entire lives trying to destroy my spirit. I stood quietly in my beautiful kitchen, watching the woman who birthed me reduce herself to a trembling mess outside my gates, perfectly content to let her exhaust her vocal cords before I finally delivered my response. The camera holds perfectly still in a tight, unblinking close-up on the high-definition security monitor mounted against the pristine white marble wall of my kitchen. The digital screen captures every single humiliating detail of Vivian's total psychological breakdown in vivid, absolute clarity. I stand there with my coffee mug resting forgotten on the quartz island, watching her press her tear-streaked face against the cold black iron bars of my front gate. Her chest heaves with violent, panicked sobs that shake her entire frame. She looks absolutely pathetic, completely stripped of her heavy country club armor and reduced to a trembling shell of a woman. She is begging for salvation from the very daughter she spent her entire life trying to violently destroy. I let my hand hover over the glowing silver intercom button for a few long, agonizing moments, allowing her to exhaust the last frantic reserves of her desperate, chaotic energy. I want her to feel the crushing weight of the silence before I speak then with a single deliberate press of my index finger. I open the two-way audio channel. A sharp, electronic chirp cuts through the crisp morning air outside, echoing loudly from the hidden speakers built into the massive stone pillars of the security gate. Vivian instantly freezes. Her manic screaming stops dead in her throat. She steps back from the thick iron bars, her wide, desperate eyes darting around the security cameras, realizing that she finally has an audience. She opens her mouth to launch into another pathetic tirade of apologies and impossible demands, but I do not give her the space to utter a single solitary syllable. My voice transmits through the exterior speakers, filling the quiet, tree-lined street. It does not carry an ounce of anger, sadness, or vindictiveness. It is completely devoid of any emotional weight. It is entirely clinical, perfectly modulated, and absolutely freezing. I address her simply by her first name, entirely dropping the title of Mother. I tell Vivian that her theatrical performance outside my property is a noise violation and a profound waste of her limited time. I instruct her to stop crying, stand up straight, and listen to the cold, hard reality of her situation, because I am only going to explain the parameters of her destruction exactly one time. I methodically dismantle her desperate pleas, one by one, stripping away every delusion she still clings to. I address her frantic request to pay off Connor's massive debt. I tell her that Connor is a reckless, arrogant criminal who actively chose to steal from the retirement accounts of hardworking people just to cover his massive cryptocurrency gambling addiction. I explain that the federal government does not accept tearful apologies, and I absolutely refuse to use my clean corporate capital to bail out a white-collar thief just to save his fragile ego from a federal prison sentence. He dug his own grave with his arrogance and greed, and now he is going to sit in it for the next decade. Turn my attention to Jasmine. Vivian had begged me not to throw my sister out onto the street, pleading for sibling solidarity. I remind Vivian that Jasmine is a 34-year-old woman who spent her entire adult life mocking my career, calling my hard work garbage and sneering at my brilliant daughter. Just hours ago, Jasmine built her entire identity on a mountain of stolen money and a toxic illusion of supremacy. I state clearly that the $3 million mansion is legally mine completely, secured by my holding company. Jasmine has exactly 24 hours to pack her designer bags, and if she needs a place to sleep on Monday night, she can move back into Vivian's guest room. Finally, I address the absolute core of Vivian's panic, which is her pristine social standing within the Atlanta church community and her elite country club circles. I tell her that her reputation was built on a foundation of absolute fraud. She paraded around town claiming her family was the pinnacle of black excellence while actively hiding the fact that her golden son-in-law was a common thief stealing from their own community. I inform her that when the federal indictments drop tomorrow morning, her precious friends will turn their backs on her faster than she can blink. Her social currency is entirely bankrupt, and no amount of my money can buy back the respect she is about to lose permanently. Vivian lets out a strangled, horrific wail, gripping the iron bars again, begging me to remember that we are a family. She cries that she is deeply sorry, that she made terrible mistakes, that she was just trying to do what was best for our future. I cut her off with brutal surgical precision. I take a slow breath, letting the heavy silence stretch out, forcing her to hang on my every impending word. I remind her of a rainy afternoon, 18 years ago. I remind her of the exact words she used when she handed a 20-year-old pregnant girl a plastic trash bag and threw her out into the freezing cold without a second thought. "You called me a failure," I say, my voice echoing clearly across the private street, carrying the weight of 2 decades of survival. "You told me I was a disgrace, a liability, and a permanent stain on your perfect family image. You looked at me carrying your own grandchild and you told me I would amount to absolutely nothing." Vivian shakes her head violently, tears ruining her expensive makeup, whispering to the camera lens that she did not mean it, that she was just angry, that she wants to take it all back. I look right at the monitor and say, "I failed at being your puppet mom, but I succeeded at being Zurich's shield." The foreclosure proceeds on Monday. I disconnect the feed, leaving her completely alone. The screen of the security monitor fades entirely to black, severing the very last tie I have to the woman standing outside my gates. I turn my back on the console and walk away from the entryway. A smooth dolly-out motion captures my movement, pulling back slowly and steadily, expanding the visual frame to reveal the breathtaking scope of my penthouse living room. The morning sunlight has shifted, giving way to the soft, moody ambiance of the early evening. The camera glides through the space, reflecting the warm light off the dark walnut wood panels and the brushed gold accents of my sanctuary. I walk over to the mahogany bar, pour myself a fresh glass of rich red wine, and sink back into the heavy leather armchair where this entire story began. The fallout was not immediate magic, but it was absolute and utterly inescapable. The wheels of federal justice turn with a slow, grinding certainty. Monday morning arrived exactly as I had promised them. At precisely 8 o'clock, a fleet of black tactical vehicles belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation pulled up to the sleek glass facade of Connor's prestigious investment firm. Agents marched straight through his lobby, bypassing the reception desk entirely. They seized every corporate server, boxed up his hard drives, and froze every single operational and personal account associated with his name. Connor was escorted out of his own building in handcuffs. His bespoke tailored suit was wrinkled and his face was shielded by a briefcase, as local news cameras captured his humiliating perp walk for the evening broadcasts. The federal indictments were formally unsealed by noon, detailing massive wire fraud, grand larceny, and the systematic embezzlement of client trust funds. There were no elite bailouts. There were no secret phone calls to powerful politicians to save him. The federal prosecutors seized his remaining frozen assets to pay back the elderly clients he stole from, ensuring that the arrogant finance director would spend the next 10 to 15 years wearing a standard-issue prison jumpsuit. Jasmine experienced the brutal, terrifying reality of financial gravity. The county sheriffs arrived at her $3 million suburban mansion on Monday afternoon, just as my legal team had scheduled. They posted the bright yellow eviction notice right over the polished brass knocker of her custom mahogany front door. She had exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises. Without Connor's stolen money, her designer credit cards were instantly declined by the luxury moving companies. The undisputed golden child who had mocked my daughters' hard work had to load her expensive clothes into heavy black garbage bags and shove them into the back of a rented economy van. She was completely stripped of her crown, her status, and her false superiority. And then there was Vivian. The social fallout in her elite circles was absolute and merciless. The ultimate punishment for a narcissist is not anger, it is total irrelevance. The moment the news broke about her son-in-law stealing from the retirement funds of their own community, Vivian became completely radioactive. The church board held an emergency meeting and formally asked her to step down from all charitable committees and leadership positions. The exclusive country club she worshipped quietly revoked her membership, citing a violation of their morality clauses. The women who used to hang on her every word, who used to validate her elite delusions, now physically crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with her. With Jasmine completely broke and Connor facing a lengthy prison sentence, Vivian had to sell her own pristine suburban home just to cover the mounting legal fees and the civil lawsuits raining down on their family. Today, the woman who demanded exclusive access to Michelin star restaurants and treated me like a permanent stain on her legacy lives in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. She shares that tiny, restrictive space with Jasmine. Two women who built their entire identities on the illusion of superiority are now forced to stare at each other every single day within thin walls they do not even own. They are entirely forgotten by the high society they sacrifice their own flesh and blood to impress. The camera continues its slow, smooth pan, shifting away from the dark reality of my former family and moving toward the bright, open expanse of my custom chef's kitchen. The warm pendant lights glow softly over the massive quartz island. Standing there completely at peace and entirely focused on her craft is Zuri. She is wearing her crisp, pristine white chef coat, beautifully embroidered with the official crest of the Culinary Institute of America. She moves with a confident, joyful rhythm, preparing a new recipe completely untouched by the destruction of the people who tried to break her spirit. She is safe. She is celebrated. She is exactly where she belongs, building her own legacy with her own two hands. I look away from my beautiful daughter and turn my gaze directly into the lens. I take one final slow sip of my wine, savoring the absolute clarity and profound peace of my life. They think the quiet ones are weak. They don't realize the quietest person in the room is usually the one holding the contract that owns the building. Have you ever used your success to silence the people who doubted you? Tell me below.